And here we are, hopefully at the final installment here of the Federal Bureaucracy, screencast number 4. So for this one, we are going to take a look at what led to the growth of the bureaucracy, as well as some other issues surrounding the bureaucracy. So we've talked a little bit about this already as we've moved through various units, but we're going to start to see that the Civil War is going to see the creation of some more agencies and some more departments that are going to start to grow the bureaucracy with the growth of industry and the growth of railroad. The first independent regulatory commission is the ICC, and that no longer exists, but again, the development of this particular agency to regulate the growth of the railroads, for example. And then with World War I, we see that there is kind of a revamping of the Department of Defense and the infrastructure. In World War I, the Great Depression is going to create the New Deal, which is going to create all of these programs that have to be administered, and so the bureaucracy is going to explode, which is also why the FDR administration is known as that first modern presidency, because it really does cement the growth and the power of the federal government, especially in a time of national crisis. And then following the Great Society, so this is like the LBJ administration, we saw the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was created, the EEOC, as an arm of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. We have the additions of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We have the Department of Transportation. You're going to see throughout the 70s, the Department of Education is going to come online. So we continue to grow. And so now we have 15 cabinet departments. The newest DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, was added in the Bush administration in 2002, and that also then restructured and moved some things from, especially the Department of Defense, underneath DHS. Policy powers of the bureaucracy. I'm not going to get in depth on this screencast for all of the policy powers, but on the quick sheet, as well as page 313 of your textbook, please go in and take a look at administrative discretion, rulemaking, regulations, and administrative adjudication. In short, administrative discretion, so we talked about standard operating procedures in the previous screencast, but there's also this idea that you have, especially your senior member officials within administrations, that should something arise and that they don't have a procedure for, or just the need to make a decision, that there is this certain element that they have to be able to discern what decisions they might need to make and to make those decisions administratively. So there is some of that wiggle room right there. Rulemaking and regulations kind of go hand in hand, but this is basically the idea of being able to create rules that run the administration or run the bureaucracy, but then also being able to create the regulations for how to implement law. Congressmen and women today don't typically get fully in depth into how a law will actually be implemented. They leave it up to the powers that be and the experts within the bureaucracy that will implement that law to come up with how that's actually going to operate and work from day to day. And then administrative adjudication, this is like what they kind of call a quasi-judicial element to the powers of the bureaucracy, in that if there is a problem that needs to be mitigated and could even potentially be a legal question, that there still is some workability within the administration of the bureaucracy to be able to try to come to some conclusion or some solution. This stuff, though, can still be challenged in court, and they cannot take the place of a court, but basically a way to negotiate. Again, take a look at page 313. It really does do a pretty good job of explaining this. And then we've kind of talked about good and bad, but kind of revisiting this question again. Some of the good things that we talked about is that they do implement laws, they give them to the people, and they enforce those laws. We've talked about how it creates red tape. It's hard to fire people. Even when you take a look at the example from class in the FBI, which is part of the Department of Justice, the head of the FBI is not someone who can be easily fired unless they have been found lacking in actually doing their job. So But President Trump felt that way and fired James Comey. But because there were people that thought that the reason he was fired was for reasons other than not doing his job, that's where the investigation into the firing of James Comey came out of. So most presidents, to a certain extent, just kind of leave bureaucrats in place because they don't want to deal with the hassle of firing them, especially if it's seen as an unwarranted firing. And then we also saw the fragmentation issues. How president and Congress can control the bureaucracy. So some of the checks and balances that we see here. This is from your textbook, so I do recommend, I forget the page number that it's on, but I do recommend that you go and take a look at some of these things. Again, recognizing that the president does have the power to appoint and remove agency heads and other top bureaucrats. It is actually pretty easy for the president to remove cabinet officials and the secretaries of the cabinet. They serve at the pleasure of the president, and we've seen if the president isn't happy, they will ask for the resignation. But then we've also seen with Jeff Sessions, he was outright fired, and that was seen as completely legitimate. It's really where you get into some of those agencies and bureaus, it gets a little bit harder. They can also, with congressional approval, make reorganizations. So the Department of Homeland Security was created in 2002. It was approved by Congress, and then there was a restructuring of several agencies. Issuing executive orders we've talked about, which helps to clarify and push bureaucracies in directions. Congress can pass legislation that alters the jurisdiction of what a bureaucracy can do in their activities. They can abolish existing programs. You can't impound funds. You can't take funds away that have been appropriated, but you can go back in and refuse to appropriate funds for certain programs or certain agencies as you're writing new legislation. The judiciary can basically make rulings as to whether regulations and policies that bureaucracies come up with comply with already existing law. And they can also rule on hearings and things that are brought up against different bureaucracies and agencies that people feel have violated their rights. So this can go, elements pertaining to the bureaucracy can go into the judicial system. And then we have a few other controls that are very important to note here. The first one is the Hatch Act of 1939. So as bureaucracy is growing, as more and more people are working within the government, there is a certain amount of power when you're kind of inside and you know the inner workings of how a system operates. And so the Hatch Act basically prohibited civil servants from taking activist roles in partisan campaigns. Federal employees cannot make political contributions. They couldn't work for a political party. They couldn't campaign for political candidates. They basically were required to stay neutral because they were in a bit of a position of power working within the government, and they didn't want to be seen as being able to manipulate that. In 1993, this was liberalized. So this basically means that now as a federal employee, you can run for an office that's nonpartisan. So for example, here in a lot of places, people that are on school boards, they're not supposed to be partisan. So you don't see Democrats and Republicans necessarily as like running those elections. That would be an example of a nonpartisan election or a supervisor. Now, yes, you're frequently going to know if someone tends to fall to the left or to the right ideologically, even in these positions, but they're considered typically to be nonpartisan. You also can contribute money. You can to political campaigns. You can vote and all of those things. You cannot use your time, your resources as a federal employee, though, to help you with those things. And then Congressional Review Act of 1996 that we've talked about in the past. Again, Congress can go in and take a look at any new policies, any new procedures. They can nullify any of those new policies and procedures that a bureaucracy is putting in place within 60 days of its initiation. So, otherwise they can go through and create legislation that, changes jurisdiction or reorganizes something that an agency is doing. Okay, a few other important issues to consider that we have talked about here. The iron triangle does help keep bureaucratic agencies powerful and kind of keep them in play, both in Congress and with interest groups and powerful corporations. And then the growth of issue networks, which is also in your textbook. But we see more people, so it opens up the triangle, and more people are involved, in university professors and think tanks and the media And they create kind of this relationship that creates this powerful pull for policy, or this powerful implementation of policy. So you see that the EPA or the groups that, the FBI, the groups that have a lot of public support and a lot of media attention, that generally can then push and pressure to make sure that they're getting the budgets that they need, or just the things done that they want to get done. Versus you've got other agencies and other commissions and other elements of the bureaucracy that are not part of an issue network, or they're not part of an iron triangle, or they're not in the spotlight, and they tend to have to, fight and struggle just a little bit more for their piece of the pie or their ability to operate. And then other important information. So I said this again. We've talked about the executive branch when we've talked about the federal bureaucracy, because the lion's share of the bureaucracy exists within the executive branch. So you can see here's the executive branch, here are the cabinet departments, and here is a smattering of the bureaucracy. There are bureaucratic elements in the legislative and judicial branches as well. The Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, the Government Accountability Office, the Congressional Research Service, for example, all within the legislative branch. So those are bureaucratic agencies that exist outside of the Senate and the House that help the legislative branch do what they need to do to function. And over here within the judicial branch, we also do have various arms here, so kind of special courts that have been created that help the court system do its job, and research and elements within the judicial system that help them do their job. But again, lion's share bureaucracy is in the executive branch. And then a few things to think about, and this comes back to this cartoon that we've seen, but do these sub-governments, do these bureaucracies, these agencies, do they have too much power? When you stop and think about the fact that many of the people will have these jobs most of their lives, there are not enough hours in the day or days in the year to have complete oversight over every single arm and every single branch, and we don't even know exactly how many of these bureaucracies and agencies and all of them put together actually exist. So there is something that people begin to wonder, and this comes back to our bureaucratic theory of how our government works and how our democracy works. Have we put too much in the power of people who are in the hands of people who are not elected and can sometimes operate with very little oversight? That's a question to consider. Then another one that comes up especially a lot today, and we've seen this play out in a lot of economic policy, a lot of our taxing policy. Should government regulate big business, or should these regulations be rolled back? What is the extent that private enterprise and a capitalist economy should have this oversight and this regulation? And especially in the 20th century and the 21st century, that's become a fairly consistent question and a fairly consistent ideological difference between different political parties, not just Democrats and Republicans. All right, and that is the end.